So just to introduce the panel today in terms of purpose, what we're really looking to talk about is the interplay between journals, between preprints and open science in the round to some degree, but focusing on those areas. We've got a great panel joining us today. So we have Ben Mudrak from ChemArchive as a preprint server. We hope to be joined by Ashley Farley from the Gates Foundation, and stepping in for Kelly Woods from F1000 at very last moment. So great many thanks to Colin Adcock from the American Physical Society, who's joined us on less than 2 days' notice. So go easy, I think would be fair to say there. Because what we're looking to talk about is really slightly more forward-looking, and it seems quite appropriate today, given that yesterday the Canadian Tri-Agency's funders announced that preprints would be a compliant mechanism for open access publishing for their grantees in the future, or at least this is the draft policy that they have out. I think I'll start with Ben and just say, we are seeing increasing numbers of policies looking at preprints as a compliant mechanism for open sharing of research. But we still, particularly in chemistry, as the discipline that we both work in, we see relatively limited uptake. What do you think we can do in order to drive that increase in uptake?
Yeah, so I think, am I on? Sorry, okay, I'm getting nods. All right, so I think that there's a number of reasons why chemistry may be a little different from some other research fields, and we have physics represented, sort of the godfathers of putting up things like these preprints. But in chemistry, there's just a lot of inertia from many people who have been publishing their research, doing their research a certain way for forever, and don't really have a need to add an extra step, even as simple as it may be. There are also sections of chemistry, especially those that relate to materials and synthesis, where there is the potential for patents and commercialization. So we hear a lot of concern around intellectual property and preserving that right as well. But I think you asked about, how do you drive that, drive uptake, and I think the approach we're taking is that sort of grassroots. As students come on and they want to share their research as early as they can, we're sort of just seeing the culture shift over time. But beyond that, it's going to be publisher advocacy and funder advocacy, national level, encouragement / requirement. I think that would really push it heavily.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I know that I spoke about this with you earlier on. When it comes to some of the culture around this, there is an element of Planck's principle, but clearly that can take a great deal of time, and we have, some would argue, a more pressing need to not wait another generation in order to drive this. So I'll just pass that over to Colin as well, because as mentioned, physics with the archive being the poster child for adoption of preprints. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah.
I think mine's working. Okay. So in physics, the uptake in preprinting is much higher, but it's extremely subject specific. So what Ben was talking about with the grassroots system is key. The people that are your peers, the people that you work with, if it is embedded in the research culture to do preprinting, then people do it. So that needs to be the ultimate goal, that it's just an accepted practice. High energy physics is backed by the Scope 3 initiative in particle physics. So everything that goes on the archive in particle physics can be published fully open access at no cost to any of the authors. That's a big carrot, but there was already a groundswell of everyone pretty much doing this anyway. But if you look at another field, quantum physics, at the point of acceptance in our Physical Review Quantum Journal, 97% of those articles were preprinted on the archive prior to acceptance. That's huge, and it shows what that discipline is doing, and other disciplines are much, much lower. So I think with us as a publisher recommending preprints and supporting preprints, and we have done since 1991, we can keep pushing that as a good way to get research out there quickly. But I think if institutions and funders, as you say, can start to talk about the benefits of preprinting for the research industry, then we will see improved uptake in other fields, but it has to be really in those subject disciplines that it's taken up.
And I think that then, and this would be a great time to have Ashley join us. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that our issues with Zoom are going to resolve fairly quickly. Would be if we look at preprint servers. So if we look at ChemArchive, which is supported by a consortium of 5 chemistry societies around the world, and you look at Scope 3, as you mentioned, which is supported by a groundswell of institutions supporting the Scope 3 initiative. As we move forwards with preprints, then we need to find mechanisms in order to support those things financially, and at a disciplinary or subdisciplinary level. Clearly, if you look within some of the examples that have been spoken about by other speakers, like GenBank, for instance, which is a subdiscipline of biology. So it's not in. It is a data repository. It is there is potentially a need for subdisciplinary preprint servers as well. How do we support that? Is that something that funders should be looking at? Is that something that societies should be looking at? Is that something that institutions should be looking at? I'd be interested to hear thoughts from Ashley, but also from Ben and from Colin.
To go first there. So the preprint service, I'm talking about the archive, it's more the area that I'm obviously working in. But they are typically funded by a range of different institutions, and that does include funders. For example, the Austrian Science Fund, the Dutch Research Council, the Simons Foundation, all support the archive in some monetary way. Other institutions do, the APS does. But I think what's really important here is that there shouldn't be particular strings attached to, supporting an initiative that's of great benefit to the research community, whether it's in earth sciences or physics or chemistry or health or anyway. It needs to be for the good of that particular subject area to grow dissemination quickly. I do have a sort of comment on this, and I think we need to be a little bit careful about how we're defining repositories and preprinting and so forth, because we have, I guess, normal preprint service repositories like the archive, like ChemArchive, and then there's other services like Veriarchive and so on that overlay peer review in there, and then have the open peer review and so forth. That's quite a different setup if you're doing all of that on top of it, and how that's funded is much closer to just how a publisher operates. And they have much closer responsibilities to that of a publisher than potentially of a repository. So I'm largely talking about repositories in the sort of original sense, but there is a sort of gap here. So maybe you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, both of the things that you broadly spoke about support the concept of societies and discipline-specific solutions to discipline-specific research, right? And I think that that's what we certainly see with ChemArchive. It's 5 different chemical societies from around the world that support the running of the site. And I think that I know I don't want to speak for her, but we did speak with Ashley before this panel, and she noted that because there are so many different disciplines and so many different sort of styles of research, that it is hard to go to any one institution or any one funder and say, we all have our hand out, we all want a little bit of something, right? So I that's again, I think why it really does work nicely to have that alignment around the community that you're trying to serve. So
the speed and openness and means to dissemination of research. This is another one.
Research articles being able to go out there, be seen by your peers for comment, or looking at, just talking to your colleagues at another university saying, I've got this article, have a look at it. It's incredibly important. You get a little bit of feedback long before you've ever had an article accepted in a journal. The preprints, I don't know if it's entirely unique, but I think it might be. Preprints are the enabling tool for Scope 3. Effectively, all particle physics posted on the archive, as I said, can be fully open access in the journals as well. So the whole lifecycle can completely open, which is effectively diamond model globally for anyone publishing in those fields, which is just great, I think. Furthermore, the preprinting process also improves integrity in fields where preprinting is expected. So, for example, in high-energy physics or quantum physics, if an article is submitted to a journal or published in a journal that hasn't been preprinted, people ask questions, why wasn't that preprinted? What are you hiding? And I think that is actually quite a good piece of integrity there. The downsides of preprinting as in terms of sort of a submitted manuscript, that's probably fairly few. But I've lost my notes. It's you have to be careful because the preprint server then turns into where accepted manuscripts go and so forth. That's not really a preprint anymore, it's an accepted manuscript. So those come with their own sets of risks for subscription journals. If all of your content is freely available, it's immediately there, that is a risk. And I think that will continue to be an issue for subscription publishers, and particularly as there are more tools out there to locate accepted manuscripts, locate version information. If an institution can see, well, all of that journal's content is immediately available, and I know it's all accepted, they've got all that information to hand, that's a powerful reason to say, actually, I don't want to subscribe to that journal. But that journal is performing the service that allows that accepted manuscript to happen, that allows green open access to happen in a sort of sustainable way. So we do have to be a little bit careful about how that continues, and hence the reason many publishers have a 12-month embargo to protect that time that they can recoup their costs for publishing articles.
If I could just step in for a second. Mark and Avi.
So again, somewhere, but every gospel we publish in the training sheet has in respect to the ROI. The ROI, which also is in
It's concerned about preprinting, skipping, and so forth. Maybe let you comment on that bit because you're obviously closer to that issue.
Yeah. So we have asked our authors what do they see as the benefits, what do they see as the things that scare them about preprinting, and what you just mentioned is certainly a pervasive concept. Is that, well, if I put something up, what's to take somebody from looking at that, rushing it out, maybe even trying to publish it somewhere, and I think that there are obviously unique cases where something like that could occur, but what we've seen is actually the opposite. So, Angewandte Chemie is one of the journals run by the German Chemical Society. Their editors are very good at that. They're looking out there. ChemArchive preprints are going to pop up in the authenticate process, for instance. And when they see that, and they see that it's not that person's research, they can kind of stop and investigate. And they've had that happen in the past, and it's actually a way for those researchers to establish priority for their thoughts, to have their name out there first, and it really kind of safeguards against what they're fearing the most. So a lot of it just comes down to, I think they're cool, I like to read them, but do I need to take that extra step? Is it just this is just an extra thing? So that's what we see. But as far as the benefits, and I promise I'll keep this pretty brief, it's a pretty clear answer when we ask our authors what they like the best, and it's the speed with which they can get these new findings out. We're able to post something within a day or two. The screening process is pretty rapid, and that is really valuable, especially to early career researchers, someone who has their very first paper that they're really excited to share, someone that's giving a talk to try to apply for a postdoc or wants a DOI for a fellowship or a grant progress report. They love that we can get something up that's citable, in the record, permanent, that they can share.
So at that point, it seems like a place where we could break for a second and see if there are any thoughts or comments, questions from the audience. Perhaps not. Perhaps we're preaching to the choir. That's fine. Oh, there we go. At the front, Bernie.
Do we have the mic?
I think I have the mic.
I just wanted to ask Colin more about the suspicions aroused by preprint articles not having been preprinted in physics. I don't know any. Sorry if everyone else knows the answer to that. I don't know anything about that world, and I'm interested in why that happens.
It's a good question. When something is so accepted in your research field, and it could be that your research data is always posted, or you always put your code on in computer science, things like that. If you're not sharing that, and if it looks like you've got something to hide, an editor or reader or referee might look and go, what's going on here? Why is that not open? Why is that not available? So there's an extra little bit of scrutiny that comes in at that point. And there could be perfectly valid reasons why they didn't want to do it. As you said, they might have something in there that you're like, I can't preprint this because it will be scooped or whatever. It might be the major news, like we've discovered a black hole, that kind of thing, and they're embargoing the accepted or the preprint accepted manuscript. Perfectly reasonable thing to do, so that the research can be properly vetted, go out as a whole after full peer review. So it's literally just, this isn't normal. Let's have a look at why this is the case. And most of the time, it's completely innocent, but it just does ring a little alarm bell that says, are they hiding something? That's all it is.
And at that point, I think we will thank Ashley for her patience while we sorted out some technical issues at our end. I'd invite Ashley to, as we've been talking about preprints and the interplay with journals up until now, just to catch you up to speed a little, talk us through the motivation in the change of Gates policy last year, and I think particularly appropriate today, as I mentioned at the start of this session, given the fact that the Canadian Tri-Agency Draft OA proposal yesterday also includes preprints as a compliant mechanism for dissemination of research. So if you could just give us a quick talk through your thinking around Gates, how you moved on from the previous policy that you had to one that really places preprints front and center.
Yes. Can I get a quick audio check?
So just minor volume issues, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Perfect. Lovely to see how large my face is on the screen. Glad we got the tech issues figured out. For those that don't know me, I'm Ashley Farley. I'm a senior officer at the Gates Foundation, and I've been working on our open access policy for over a decade now. And some of the elements that we reviewed within a decade that led to our policy change is our two main goals around the open access policy was to ensure fast, equitable access to our research grant outputs. And so kind of the speed, the equitable access are kind of our two main motivators there. And over the past decade, we've noticed the increasing and inequitable costs of article processing charges or open access fees to make the version of record openly available. We've instituted the rights retention strategy. And then we've experienced different blockers into helping our grantees be able to achieve. And I think we've shared our experiences with the tri-agencies in Canada, and I think that's one of the reasons that they've crafted the policy that the way they have, which is great to see as a result. We also saw a lot of improvements in the preprint ecosystem during the pandemic, and how during COVID-19, preprints really helped accelerate interventions and share research in a way that the traditional publishing system maybe struggled to keep up. Of course, we are very well aware of all of the concerns and hesitations around preprints, but I thought that it was, a really interesting moment to be able to shift our policy in a way that we think allows grantees to easily and quickly comply, while also then publishing as needed for their career advancement or for further dissemination within the community, because we know preprints haven't quite achieved kind of the curation or discoverability that journal articles still have. But we thought it was an important shift because it feels like kind of the reliance on making the journal version of record openly available. It's kind of costing us everything in the open access elements. And I'll pause there.
And I think that raises another interesting thought for me, which was something that I wanted to talk about today, which is looking at COVID-19. We certainly did see preprints operating as an extremely rapid way to disseminate results. But at the same time, there were weaponized preprints that were put into the public domain. And so thoughts on that, and I fully acknowledge the previous session to this was looking at research integrity and how journals haven't necessarily always done as good a job as they could have done, but recognizing that there is little check and balance on a preprint, certainly in terms of getting it in front of people. Thoughts on what perhaps we might need to do in the future. I'm thinking of preprint reviews through services like PubPeer or things of that nature. Any thoughts from any of you? I'll invite Colin to speak first as the journal publisher.
You're going easy on me today. I'm going to start by saying that anywhere that is a steward of knowledge must take ethics and integrity extremely seriously. Now, publishers, as we saw in the previous talk, publishers and other platforms really need to do better, and they need to set the standards. And we're seeing this. Publishers are engaging with multiple different technologies to address integrity issues that are cropping up in the landscape. And I fully agree, retractions are a part of the industry, and rightly so. There's plenty of retractions that are just an author has made a mistake or there's been an oversight, and that is part of how things should be done. Repositories I don't work for repositories, but they must balance speed, cost, and risk in their moderation process. How that works ultimately will depend on the field, whether it's a health field, medicine, or physics or chemistry. So there are things that you need to do differently and address differently in those different areas. I don't know how best to do that, because I don't actually know exactly what you guys do in the preprints area already. So I will hand it over to you to talk about that.
I'm basically going to start paying you to write my essays, though, because I think you said that very eloquently, and I think it's another argument for discipline-specific solutions, because medRxiv has a very nice two-step process that involves clinical professionals and making sure that what's put out, even while relatively rapid, is not unsafe. It's not, that there's going to be potential errors, there's going to be potential improvements over time, but at its core, there's real science. And we do screen everything that comes to ChemArchive. We have a chemistry PhD that looks at it to say, okay, is this a scientific question? Is this scientific information being presented? We can't promise every detail is correct. That's definitely the next step. But I think that discipline-specific angle really helps here. But then I think that the problem with looking at something that you see online and using that, either weaponizing it or as disinformation, as misinformation, how to guard against that sort of information literacy, it's much wider than just scientific articles that we're seeing right now. There's a lot of struggle across the entire world, right? With taking things out of context and kind of running with it. And it's something that I know, having kids in elementary and middle school, you know, is trying to see them, the teachers and us at home, trying to kind of equip them to take something, pull it together, but don't rely on it immediately if it's the only one place you're hearing it, kind of thing. So I think there's more to be done worldwide that will trickle down. That's a bad term. That's going to really, you know, also help with preprints being out there.
And Ashley, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I actually think that preprint servers do have a higher level of moderation and checks, depending, of course, on the server than we think. There's been some interesting work published recently as a preprint on the moderation practices of preprint servers. We launched Verarchive in partnership with F1000 to test additional checks to kind of raise that trustworthiness, and exploring kind of what trustworthiness in preprints looks like and how can that be demonstrated to readers. How can but that does slow down the process of posting that preprint then. So that's, I think, the statement of balance of resources to do that, and is a really great comment. I think having the tools available for the community to address concerns is critical. But yeah, I think in some ways, if somebody is going to try to weaponize something, they'll do it no matter what, and it's a broader concern than just the mode in which they do that. You might have seen, you know, here in the U.S., we're seeing the current kind of administration and climate that journals are being spun up and hiding, but having the same traditional journal model and kind of almost weaponizing peer review to post and publish disinformation, and that's very concerning to see. So I think it's larger than just the mechanism of the communication, whether the preprint or a published article. So I think having the tools available for researchers to be able to express concerns and have that follow up with. I love the call out to literacy, media literacy, understanding research. As a librarian by trade, that's I think very important, and building that up is critical.
Yeah, and I think it also touches upon one of the sessions at the conference yesterday, looking at trust markers. That if you could apply a trust marker to a journal, if you can standardize some kind of approach towards this journal does the right things in the right way, that could equally be applied to preprints in the same way. I also note from Nature earlier this year that there's now the wonderfully named Withdrawarchive for withdrawals from archive itself, and so perhaps being able to track the full spectrum of the scholarly literature, even those things where people have perhaps realized that they made an error in their research and then have withdrawn it, that has value in itself as well, in terms of, you know, blind alleyways of research, not even just negative results, but like inappropriate mechanisms for analyzing data that on the surface of it may have seemed like a sensible way. The talk of media literacy actually leads me onto one of the reasons that I moved into open access, certainly, in the very early days of my career, which was I used to work as a practitioner environmental scientist, so not a researcher, someone who was just doing welly boot science, wandering around landfill sites, taking water samples and doing basic analytical chemistry on them. And I found that one of the things that drew me towards open access was that we had no corporate library, and so I would find research in abstract form that would potentially offer a protocol that would allow me to do something I needed to do, but I had no access to it. Preprints certainly can address that issue, as can the wider open access. But as I was not a researcher, I was not properly skilled in order to appraise the research that I was reading, and so I had to use peer review as a surrogate for that being of a suitable level of quality. And so I think that leads into that media literacy point around what can preprint servers, what can publishers, what can we do beyond kind of programmatic approaches like trust markers? Are there more that we should be doing? Should we be as an industry asking researchers to provide plain language summaries of their research. And I know that isn't necessarily a core researcher skill. So just spinning off at a slight tangent from that earlier point. Would anyone like to comment?
Yeah, so I think that, and you alluded to this a little bit, but we and most other preprint servers at this point have been watching sort of since the pandemic, especially, take a lot of care to label things as preliminary, the documents that are there, the pages, the home page. Not that that's a solution, but just that it's an understanding and acknowledgement that there is that potential for misinformation. Yeah, we did talk a little bit about lay summaries, and I think I'll speak largely with my own lens here, but we're very beholden to what the research article looks like in chemistry and where it goes from there. And so I don't know that even if we were to say, hey, I want you to take time to do something you're not probably really comfortable doing, you're not really good at, I don't know how many people would even do that as part of a submission to ChemArchive if they're not going to have to do it as part of the submission to the journal. So I've always hoped that there could be, because the content is open, and have had conversations with others, is there a way to layer some other kind of service on top? And I'm not talking strictly just AI letting machines go wild, but something else that could layer on top of that broader research output to help distill it for a wider audience.
Ashley, Colin, any?
Yeah, I find it interesting that you use the peer review as a trust marker, but don't necessarily see the peer review reports to, I think, kind of bolster that trust. So I think that's something that it can even help. I'm a huge proponent of open peer review, and I think that also helps the readers see the process. And as somebody who's not often a technical expert in a lot of the areas in which I engage with in global health, global development, I'm able to learn through reading those open peer review reports. I think that's very helpful as well. I know that's still nascent in the preprint space, but I think it's something that could develop with time. And then the other thing that I instantly thought of is how I think a lot of people are going to turn to AI tools to help in that case. And I think ChatGPT is just integrating, is it deep research, and so this idea of being able to talk to the literature and be able to understand it more effectively or distill it down. Like, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out and how that kind of affects the space.
I just wanted to add to this, this, like everything, very wildly depending on the subject area, this sort of summary is going to be most useful in settings that are more traditionally public facing, health and medical things, so forth. Is it really that useful in complicated high energy physics articles? Probably not, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do something to make this more accessible to people in general. So I agree, AI lay summaries are a good start there. But there are other routes that I'm not familiar with the medical space, but it should be the case that if there's some study coming out that says something very important about vaccines, that that's really good or whatever, there should be a summary about what that means to someone who's actively looking in that space who is not a researcher. That feels like a good thing to have, and it feels like that should be embedded in the research culture if you're producing that kind of research, especially. In other fields, like certainly in the fields that I work in, it's more covered by things like magazines and specialist science communicators talking about things like black holes or anything that's complicated, basically, because as you say, it's a very specialist skill set to translate really complicated physics or science or anything into something that everyone can understand. And that's, I would say, science or physics is not just that, it goes into the humanities. It's why we see these wonderful TV programs by communicators in archaeology, for example, talking about how that works. I've no idea how that works. That's great for me to see and understand all of that context. So it's not just a science thing.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to open it up to the floor again to see if there are any further questions. I think we've got one in the middle at the back. Yeah, Mike. The mic. So I think from wearing a previous hat to this one, if I put that back on again very quickly, I previously worked for Springer Nature, who run a preprint server and peer review, trying to open the black box, a little service called InReview, which is operated by Research Square, who I also believe Ben used to work for. So yes, I can see value in that because it still is making the work accessible. And I can see the value in embedding that preprint submission into a journal publication workflow, not least because it does allow you to, going back to Ashley's point around peer review, it allows you to better expose the work that goes on through the peer review process to improve a piece of research. I'll let Ben speak to some of the issues with that. But the one thing I would say, and this is something that's echoed also with research data repositories, is that once you have a community repository where the community know to go there to find certain things, so looking at GenBank being a classic example, if you're working on gene sequences, everything's going into GenBank. If it's separated into lots of other repositories, it inevitably becomes more fragmented, and consequently link rot and all kinds of other things can start to become problematic, even with persistent identifiers, which I'm sure most people know aren't always the most persistent. But I'll pass over to Ben's thoughts.
I think you covered it really well. I personally, I guess I'm at the point where at the moment I like to see preprints, and if publishers have these easy sort of seamless systems to allow researchers in all kinds of fields to post a copy of their manuscript as they're submitting it, I think there's value in creating that critical mass. I really think you hit these both perfectly. The other piece of it, though, is that you become a little more fragmented. We already have, we got to get on the train that you're on, because I think that, in chemistry, there's not a lot of connection between the journal article and the preprint. And then again, if the field is much more fragmented, you just start to have multiple copies pop up. We see that already. Our authors will have something that goes up on SSRN because they're submitting it to an Elsevier journal, and they also submit one to ChemArchive because they like the community there. And we have this just, the same thing is in multiple places, and there's not a good way to connect all that, especially in the metadata. So that's the challenge, I think, of that world. But and you do lose a little bit of, I know that, for instance, the Research Square team, that they also look at medical preprints with more scrutiny, right? So I know that they do. I think a lot of others do the same, but you lose some of that field-specific understanding of what is a critical missing element of a manuscript, when it's just no way that they could specialize in every single one of those fields efficiently.
Yeah, I just had to. I largely agree, and yes, if there's nothing nowhere else to put that, then having a preprint is better than no preprint. But having kind of walled gardens in a sort of publisher specific or even funder specific or country specific, that doesn't make sense to me. I feel like it should be for everyone. Like if I'm publishing a paper in chemistry, I go to work, put it in chemistry, and then I can continue my research and put it wherever I want. Or I think if I was to send that to a specific publisher, they're going to have their own vested interest in how they manage those preprints, how they market to you, how they then go into other journals and so forth. And I think that independence is really quite an important aspect of repositories like ChemArchive, Archive, Earth Archive, etc.
And I guess the flip side of that to Ashley would be, how does Gates feel about, obviously you're investing time, money and effort into VeriChive. How do you feel about the use of disciplinary repositories versus funder repositories and or preprint servers, I should say? But what's your take? Are you agnostic? Do you think that it should all be held, like a specific institution or funder's work should all be held in one place?
No, and while we are investing in Verichive, we still welcome our grantees to choose a preprint server of their choice, because I think that's very important. Some of the reasons we've gone with more of a specific Verichive option, aside from the additional trust markers that we're experimenting with, is we have a large swath of grantees where preprinting is not a common practice for them in their discipline and still very new to them. And so we are helping, I think, build that practice by giving them an option that we support. It's integrated into our grants management system, so we get to verify the grant metadata, which is really important to us. And metadata is something that I think is a struggle for preprint servers overall, and we're looking to see how we can improve that. I think the issue around duplicates is also a really fascinating one that we haven't really had a chance to discuss as a community of how do we manage those? How do they link to one another if possible? It's a problem I'm hoping that we can work on in the next few years. But I do like the discipline nature, the specific nature of it, and it makes me think that we are then moving towards like a future of more embracing the concept of publish, review, and curate, because what's really strong about journals in that community is that they know, and they know the discipline, they have that expertise, and they can apply that to the preprints in that space. So I can see us getting to more of that model versus posting the preprint and then going on to publish somewhere else. So I think that allows us to be able to experiment and build up kind of a different model of publishing for the future.
And I think I saw one other question at the back there. So the lady with the hand raised.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was about, and I was just trying to remember where I saw it, but I couldn't see. Earlier this year, there was an article published which was saying that beyond academia, the majority of people still don't understand how a preprint differs from a peer-reviewed research article. And obviously, kind of, we're talking about researchers and reuse of material, and trust markers will come some way to kind of showing how a preprint has been checked. I just wondered, kind of from the panel, what else do you think can be done to really make it clear how a preprint, how it's been verified, but also how it's different from a research article that's been peer reviewed?
Yeah, so I think this is a case where we're looking. I'm always looking to meet other preprint servers and even embed myself in organizations like ASAP Bio, even though we're not strictly biology, but find those groups that do engage in some form of outreach, right? I mean, I think what ultimately it's going to take is awareness that they exist will turn into then an opportunity to say, okay, if you're coming up through high school science, maybe, right, and you're talking about research that's out there, that's probably the time to say, look, research takes these kind of different forms, and and you're not an expert, that's okay, but just understand that there is this sort of spectrum out there. So obviously that's not a snap my fingers and do it kind of thing. And I feel as though, unfortunately, we're at, and especially in chemistry, just the awareness that this is a reasonable step among our researchers is really low. And so even thinking beyond that to the broader public is something we shouldn't put off, but we're still in pretty early days.
And I'll just add, because it's been touched upon, and my apologies to medRxiv if I misrepresent this, but in terms of the checking that is done prior to publication of those, part of the approach towards minimizing the potential harm of this is if it's clinical data that is presented that the conclusion of which is incorrect could cause public harm. So if it's a preprint that says this drug doesn't work, they will not post that preprint for exactly that reason, because it could be misconstrued. It hasn't been peer reviewed. It hasn't gone in front of other people. So I think there are checks and balances that can be put in place in order to mitigate risk and to not expose potentially unverified, unreviewed articles through to the general public. And again, as we saw in the previous session, even when we have Wakefield's paper wasn't retracted for 12 years. So there are issues of that nature with journal publishing as well, and there have been for the longest time. Okay, I think we've got 10 minutes left, so I think that I'm going to start off on the next one with our publisher. So given that arXiv didn't cause the collapse of all physics journals globally, what should the relationship between preprint servers and journals look like? And in fact, if you want to go beyond that, with other open research artifacts, open data and so on.
Sure, that's not a dangerous question at all. The arXiv has been in existence since 1991. Lots of physics publishers have been engaging with it since then, especially APS. And it's always been for researchers. It's for them to do science better and quicker, to get content out there, as we talked about before. And this is worked successfully alongside and in collaboration with publishers for that, well, since then. And when we talk about preprints, you're absolutely right. I don't think it has done any particular damage. But when we're looking at the arXiv as a whole, it does take accepted manuscripts. It does take other versions and so forth. So I think we must be careful there, because that type of publishing is funded by subscriptions. It's green open access. And there is a growing focus. I've already talked about this. There's a growing focus in this space to have tools to access accepted manuscripts, to surface those for everyone. So I actually don't think it's fair to say that the arXiv hasn't killed publishers. I think that's still to be seen. Like I said before, if everything's available, does that mean stuff is cancelled? I think that's an open question. A more fair and more accurate point might say preprints haven't killed physics. I think that's absolutely right. They boost physics, they boost science, they boost discovery, and preprints are a great way of doing that. Green OA is a different conversation, kind of entirely, that is, not at this point fully resolved.
Yeah, but unsurprisingly, as someone from a publisher, I agree. But okay, so in terms of the interplay between journals and preprints, Ben, your thoughts?
So I think the philosophy at ChemArchive, at least, I'll mostly just want to speak for myself and not others, is we really see preprints as they are a tool for sharing research, and that lends itself as a tool to being used in different ways. And in chemistry, we're not really yet up and running with the sort of publish, review, curate model or preprint peer review the way other fields are, but we do see it sometimes. And what happens largely is that the preprint is peer reviewed, and they leave a comment with the link to the peer review, output, and the final, we link to final products where they're available. So we, as a platform, we want to serve people who want different things, right? In some cases, they really just want to share something. They're not intending to get it peer reviewed. Maybe it's sort of negative data, or it's another type of research that they want to share, but that's the endpoint. Well, great. In other cases, they are submitting at the same time to a journal, and they really do want that deeper connection. And I'd love to build those bridges to have a little bit more. We do have a transfer system to go out, so if someone posts a preprint, they're able to submit out to a number of journals. But so we work in some cases very closely and tightly. In other cases, I think we can be just the endpoint. And I personally really like that we aren't trying to drive everyone into one of those directions. We'll see where our community goes and support them on the path.
Any thoughts to add to that, Ashley?
Yeah, I think it allows for hopefully for more experimentation, both around publishing models and the business models. So I think we're seeing some data trend that we're seeing more paywalled research than open access research from a version of record at the journal. And when we talk about subscriptions covering the cost of the peer review for author accepted manuscripts, which I think is a really important point, it can allow, I'm a big proponent of the subscribe to open model that's been growing, especially in small disciplines and journals and societies, to allow them to find a sustainable open access business model. And I think preprints and preprint servers allow for that experimentation to happen without holding back access to that research.
Thank you. So being cognizant of the fact that we're about to go into a break and not wanting to keep people from coffee on the second day afternoon, I think the last question to each of the panelists would be, given the rapidly evolving global landscape that we see with different mandates around the world, looking at open, not open, green, gold, preprints, what does the future of scholarly communications look like? So just not just a small question to end with. I'm going to go for, I'll start with Ashley, because I like the answer that you put in the notes.
Okay. So I've been trying to answer this question for a decade now, but I do think, to be completely honest, it's going to be chaotic for some time. But I think there could be creative experimentation coming out from the chaos when we talk about duplications of preprints and just more and more information. We have the interplay of what AI is doing. We're trying to test and support different business models. There's a lot happening right now, and I don't think there's one model or one way of publishing that is looking to win out at this point. But I do think there's a lot happening, a lot to follow, but there's a lot of potential and opportunity there. And that's what I'm most excited about, is to see what we can test and try. And maybe in the next decade, we will have more of a steady state for the future of publishing.
Ben?
I mean, I think chaotic is a good word. I mean, it's just going to be messy. It already certainly is for us as a preprint server, just in terms of when you talk to others that post preprints, how widely different our approaches are. And that's just, we are the one tiny corner of everything we've discussed here. So I guess I'm imagining a scenario maybe like movie file formats, or I got my AC adapter, I've got a plug adapter to come to the UK. And I think that there will be probably a few formats and systems that will coalesce across the world, where maybe you start to have like, okay, or do you do A or B or C? And that's just going to kind of happen naturally. And I certainly don't have a way of predicting exactly what those are going to look like. I'm just here for the ride.
I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic, actually. I agree the future is mixed. I'm not, chaotic is maybe a bit strong for me. I believe openness throughout the ecosystem, not just open access, but open science, will grow. We are doing a lot of that at APS at the moment. And I think integrity will grow. Will there be more bad actors and more attractions? Of course there will. But publishers are going to get better, and platforms are going to get better at handling how to deal with that, because we want to make sure that ultimately science is really good quality, and that we are stewarding it for future generations and looking after it, because that's our job. So we'll be increasing the quality of science through openness. But we are, as I say, in a very uncertain climate, and that's going to lead to us acting pragmatically rather than ideologically. We'll be continuing to do agreements with different types of models. APS has like 5 different models, something like that. We have the oldest diamond journal in physics. We have Scope 3, which is sort of a subject-wide diamond journal. We have gold journals, and we have green open access as well. And all of these serve slightly different communities and different purposes and different regions and different subjects. And I think that's okay. I think people are different around the world, subjects are different around the world, but we have to continue to progress this and continue to increase the level of openness that we have. But this has been a theme of the conference, openness cannot come at any cost. And we have to be careful about going too far too quickly, and we must be as a pragmatic. I'm going to end this on a bit of something I wrote, and we cannot place human achievement at the whims of individuals, individual governments, funders, and so on. We have to continue this throughout the next 5, 10, 100 years, because this is how human endeavor and human science and human research continues and exists in a high quality way.
And with that call for a united global endeavour, I think I will thank our panellists for their time, and thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris and panel. That was wonderful. I'm sorry about the little problems we had earlier on. That was entirely my fault, not scheduling enough testing time before we got into the panel. So I'm sorry about that. Right now it's time for a quick break and get caffeinated. And then we're coming back to find out whether you were in the best workshop or not. And then we have a keynote. So see you after the break. Thank you very much.